At the height of Prohibition, Al Capone was making a fortune from illegal liquor in Chicago. But hundreds of miles away, a federal lawman was raiding bootleggers, seizing stills, and confiscating the same kind of liquor that made Capone famous. He called himself Richard Two-Gun Hart, and there was something that most people around him did not know. His name was James Vincenzo Capone. He was Al Capone's older brother. So how did two brothers end up on the opposite sides of Prohibition? James Vincenzo Capone was born in Italy in 1892, 7 years before his younger brother Al. The family eventually settled in Brooklyn, but James did something unusual while still a teenager. He left. Around the age of 16, he headed west and gradually separated himself from not only New York, but from the Capone identity itself. He eventually became known as Richard James Hart and settled in Homer, Nebraska, where he married and built an entirely different reputation. Hart embraced the image of a Western lawman wearing a broad-brimmed hat and carrying two pistols at his sides. By the time national prohibition took effect in 1920, the man born James Capone was living a life that looked nothing like the one his younger brother was beginning to build in Chicago. Prohibition gave Hart an opportunity to turn that identity into a career. He began working against bootleggers, locating illegal stills, participating in raids, and helping confiscate illicit liquor. He later worked as a special agent for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where stopping illegal alcohol from reaching reservations became part of his job. Hart operated across parts of the Dakotas and the Northwest, and his two-pistol appearance helped him earn the nickname Two-Gun Hart. A photograph taken in North Dakota in 1926 shows him surrounded by confiscated stills and bottles of liquor. Hart had successfully transformed himself from James Capone, the son of an Italian immigrant family in Brooklyn, into a recognizable Western lawman whose reputation depended partly on putting bootleggers out of business. By the middle of the 1920s, the contrast between the brothers was almost impossible to believe. In Chicago, Al Capone was becoming one of the most powerful figures in an illegal liquor trade created by Prohibition. Hundreds of miles away, Richard Hart was being paid to attack that same trade. Hart went after stills, seized liquor, and pursued men selling alcohol illegally, while Al's organization profited enormously from supplying the alcohol Americans continued to demand. In 1927, Hart's reputation was strong enough that he was among the lawmen assigned to help protect against President Calvin Coolidge during the president's stay in the Black Hills. One Capone brother was becoming nationally infamous for defying Prohibition. The other had built a reputation enforcing it. While most of the people around him had no idea the two men were brothers. But by the late 1930s, the distance Hart had created between himself and the Capone family had begun to collapse. His federal law enforcement career was largely behind him. The Great Depression had left his family struggling financially, and his eyesight was deteriorating. In 1937, while Al Capone was serving his sentence at Alcatraz, Hart contacted his brother Ralph and asked for financial help. Ralph gave it to him and continued assisting him. Then, after Al was released from federal custody in 1939, the brothers eventually met again. After spending much of his adult life distancing himself from the Capone name, Richard Hart was back in contact with the family he had left decades earlier. The former Prohibition lawman was now reconnecting with a brother whose name had become synonymous with bootlegging. The extraordinary connection became national news in 1951 when Hart was called to Chicago during a federal chase involving his brother Ralph. Newspapers reported that Richard Two-Gun Hart, the Western lawman and former federal officer, had actually been born James Vincenzo Capone. To readers who knew Al Capone as perhaps the most famous gangster of the Prohibition era, the revelation sounded almost fictional. Hart returned to Nebraska after the publicity and died in Homer the following year at the age of 60. By then, the secret left he had spent decades constructing was no longer a secret. Al Capone and James Vincenzo Capone were born into the same family and grew up in the same Brooklyn household. Yet, Prohibition sent their lives in a completely different direction. Al became the symbol of the bootlegger, while James reinvented himself as Richard Hart and built a reputation hunting men who did much of the same work that made his brother rich. One brother became one of America's most famous criminals. The other carried a federal badge and became known as Two-Gun Hart. And perhaps the strangest part of their story is that the same law helped create both of them. Thank you to everyone liking and subscribing to the channel. If you would like to write the Eclectic Historical Society, you can send us a letter to this address, and we will return the favor with a hand-typed letter on our 1930s typewriter. With that being said, this is the Eclectic Historical Society, and remember, history is lost if it isn't repeated.